enormous Jewish contribution to comics, and briefly the graphic novel, because we are in the Eisner room. That Jews really built the comics industry from the ground up. Can everyone hear me in the back? Great. The influence of Jewish writers and publishers and artists continues to be felt to this day. So I'm interested today, like some questions I want to pursue is, how did Jews become enmeshed in, like, have such a disproportionate influence on an industry that is famous for like lantern-jawed demigods, and they're clad in colorful tights? Like, this is Technicolor. I love this. This is just a nice slide to start with. But how do comics translate into graphic novels? What is the Jewish graphic novel even? So the first comic books, let's see, the story begins in 1933. During that year, the world's experiencing seismic changes, right? We've got Hitler becomes Chancellor of Germany, FDR is inaugurated. Then was also born the American comic book. And in the early days, the comic books were really reproductions, right? There was a backlog of comics, a very, somebody with a lot of foresight named Maxwell Charles Ginsburg changed his name to Charlie Gaines or Max Gaines, Jewish. He says, what can we do with all these past comics? Let's put them in a book. We can have a comic book. No, we don't just need them in the newspaper. There's wider readership for that. Well, ultimately, you're going to run out of comics from the newspaper to reproduce in a comic book. What are you going to do? You need to have artists and writers to make new comics. So what do we do now? Who's going to make these? Well, Jews are starting this industry. Jewish people don't have as many opportunities in, say, advertising. And so that opens up a new world for these young Jewish comic book writers and artists. They have a chance to break into a new medium. They don't really have a lot of other choices. So let's see what this is about. Enter, these are my guys, Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster. They're from Cleveland. I'd never been to Cleveland before until I moved there for my job. And I just coincidentally happened to land, that was a pun, land where Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster have landed, and they created Superman. So they're from Glenville. They're from Cleveland. They were in high school and they conceived Superman. They have trouble placing him for a long time. We have up on the screen right here, Superman, the first issue. It's from 1938, Action Comics. And then he gets an issue as a standalone character in 1939. So we have these two images. These early comics, we're working out Superman's history, Superman's story. We get to hear his origin stories ultimately. Hold on. And this is from Superman 1. And I think it's really interesting. I have to say that Jerry Siegel was really funny. He wrote in a very cinematic way, and he's funny. So it's not what you would expect. Here he's teasing this guy, he's flying with him. And I'll read this because I know it's sometimes hard to see when it's a whole page, not just a single panel, but I don't like isolating single panels. I feel like it doesn't tell the whole story. But he's teasing this guy, he's taking him flying, and he said, oops, I almost touched that pole, meaning the guy would get electrocuted. Look, the Capitol, let's pay it a visit. Take me down, help. And he said, and then Superman says, oh, I missed, like he's gonna fall. So he's silly and he's funny, and Superman has changed over the years. We have dark Superman in like some movies, like really dark. The Man of Steel incarnation was kind of dark, but early on, that's not what the boys were about. So begins the startling adventures of the most sensational strip character of all time, Superman. And so, truth, justice, and the American way, and the Man of Steel, the Man of Tomorrow, all these different terms, they've changed over time. And, faster than a locomotive, that's from the TV show. That wasn't Siegel and Shuster. So then also in these early panels, we had this description of the boys and what they're about. So this is Jerry, this is Joe, and they're also were the creators of other comics. They started really, they were in high school, they decide to make some comics, they hire a model. And they've advertised in the Plain Dealer, they hire a model, she comes to the studio, comes to the house at this point, and Joe draws her. Ultimately, Jerry Siegel married that model. After they'd been separated for a long time, they just sort of came back together and met somewhere else. So it's a nice love story in that way. And their daughter became a journalist. She's like the real life Lois Lane. So I'm really interested in how, if we talk about the Jewish origins, I'm interested in how Superman is incorporated into the war, for example. So Superman battles Hitler in this Look magazine article. I know you can't see it, but I simply want to get you set up for the idea of Jewish comic makers and how they combated fascism in their art. And in this particular case, Superman in the second page, it's just a 2-pager. He's holding Hitler, up in the air. He ultimately takes Hitler to a tribunal. So the origin story of Superman, does anybody know anything about that? So he was born on Krypton. His dad, Jor-El, realized Krypton's going to explode. We better send him somewhere. Let's send him to Earth, where he has especially great powers. So some commentators believe that Superman is Jewish. There's actually a recent book out, great book, not a great title. So it's like a wonderful scholarly account of all the different aspects of Superman's Jewishness or possible Jewishness, or even like the Christian, how he's portrayed in ways that might incorporate Christianity. It's called Is Superman Circumcised? So it got an award. It got an award for the oddest title of the year. So Superman comes to a strange land as an alien. Well, some Jews, they came to a strange land and they felt like aliens. He's taken in by a kind couple of the Kents, and he has a chance to make good. Right? The Jewish imperative on earth is to make good, tikkun olam, to leave this world a better place. But let's try something else too. Moses is floated away to a strange land to be raised by not his family in a basket. Superman comes in a basket-like spaceship to be raised by strange people not of his culture. Like Moses, Superman never forgets who he is. He's a stranger at home and at home simultaneously. He changes his name. So his name was Kal-El. He changed it to Clark Kent. Many Jews came to America and changed their names. Did you know that Kirk Douglas's real name was Izyor Danielovich? So Superman also changes his name. Kal-El, El means deity in Hebrew. Kal-El, so the Kal has been interpreted differently by different people, like, swift like God and voice of God, but nevertheless, Kal-El, his dad was Jor-El. Superman, in one sort of story about him, was he visits the bottled city of Kandor, the only remaining city of his home planet that was shrunk inside a bottle, just like in the diaspora, Jews visit Israel. So those are just some would argue that Superman is a retelling of the Moses story in science fiction. So when we think about Superman from that perspective, and we see that he's battling fascism in various works. I love the image on the right from Superman 1942. And in this case, we have him rounding up Hitler and Toho and taking them away once again. Now, the stories inside of these comics weren't often about the war. So it's the covers that would tell us something about the war. But that's okay in most cases, because those covers would be on newsstands and people would see them and they would offer it as propaganda. You don't have to go inside the comic book necessarily. And they're bright and they're energetic. And ultimately, a superhero is invented simply to fight the Nazis. And that would be Captain America. There's Captain America is on the left. This is the first issue. It's from 1941. And Joe Simon and Jack Kirby. Joe Simon was like Heine. Jack Kirby, who's really like the king of comics. He was born Jacob Kurtzberg. So they're sons of immigrants, and I think this comic book cover says it all. We have Captain America stalking out Hitler. That cinematic style becomes the Marvel style, and Kirby really, he creates that. So again, Jacob Kurtzberg, he's going to come up again in a few minutes because he is so influential on so many different of these superhero comics. I also want to point out, we have a World's Finest Comics, 1942 on the right. We have Batman and Robin and Superman. I find this comic to be particularly interesting because it's not about Superman and Batman knocking anybody, out. It's about, hey, let's congratulate. Who are the real heroes? They're the servicemen. They're the American servicemen. And there's Superman with his arm, approvingly around one soldier. And then we have Robin shaking another one's hand. And once again, we have, Batman looking over this. This looks good. And these comic books ended up, they were in pockets of GIs. They were traded during the war. Americans, again, read them at home, support for the war. A lot of these supported the war in other ways. I just wanted to have this up briefly. Batman, so that while I said that most of the time there weren't war stories inside, think about the dates. 1941, we have Captain America, but by 43, these comic books get a little more aggressive. So this is a Batman and Robin. You can see there's a swastika on the front and a stereotypical German face. And the story inside is swastika over the White House. And it's very strong. It's a very strong, Batman and Robin managed to thwart an attempt for the Fuhrer to take over the White House. But comics too participated in the war effort and trying to get the average person to buy bonds to ensure the 4th of July, sometimes to the point of caricature, which we can see here on the left. The comic book cover on the left is spring 1943. It's playing on the beginning of baseball season as they throw these baseballs to knock out the Axis. And then to ensure the 4th of July once more, buy war bonds, buy stamps. And that's what we see on the right in this comic as well. So when we're talking about comic books, there's a lot of discussion about superheroes and comic books. This is fantastic. I just picked a random Fantastic Four. There's nothing particularly special about this cover, except that we can see the different characters in the Fantastic Four, especially the Thing. Is everybody familiar with the Fantastic Four? All right, so there's lots of movies. Before, like years ago, I would talk about this stuff and I'd have to explain, this is the Fantastic Four, and Captain America was made from a super soldier syndrome, super soldier serum. But Fantastic Four, so the Thing, he's my favorite. I love the Thing. He's this big boulder-like creature. Cosmic rays transformed him from a person, an average person, into the Thing. His real name was Ben Grimm. And Ben Grimm, we're going to see in a second. Some say he's a golem, like an ancient sort of Jewish mythological figure. I'm not so sure about that. But, I should mention that, let's go back for 1 second. Captain America was published by Martin Goodman, a Jew. Captain America, sort of the Marvel comics were originally Timely Comics, and then Marvel takes over, and we're going to talk a little bit more about that. But Rogers is specifically, Steve Rogers, meaning Captain America, is specifically fighting Hitler, and he does have this Bucky sidekick, just like Batman has his kid sidekick of Robin. So Fantastic Four. This is my favorite issue of Fantastic Four lately. I know you can't read it, but I wanted to show you, these are what comic book pages look like. They have panels, they have gutters. We have to imagine sometimes what's happening between each panel. And this particular story, it's remembrance of things past. Play on words. Remembrance of things past. We remember things past, but the Thing is remembering his past. And in this story, So, we look backwards, we say, oh, there's Jewishness in these comic books and these superheroes. Well, in this case, the Thing goes back to Yancey Street, where he was from originally in this story. Ben Grimm goes back, and he's going back to make amends. Mr. Schreckerberg owned a shop, and when Ben Grimm was young, he stole a Star of David from that shop. This isn't a comic book that's going to be in a comic book store. This is not made for Jews. This is just that comic book writers in the 21st century and the late 20th century are reading these Jewish origins in and giving Jewish stories to the Thing or to Superman and so forth. So in this case, he goes back, the Thing goes back to try and make amends. There's a fight, and Mr. Schreckerberg gets hurt, and he's on the ground, and the Thing leans over him, and he thinks he's dead. And he says the Shema, which is the prayer that we're supposed to say if you're dying and you say it for yourself or someone says it for you. In the comic book, Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, and so forth. But then Mr. Schreckerberg, wakes up. He didn't really die. And he says, I'm glad you still remember your Hebrew school training, Ben. and Ben, meaning the Thing, wants to give him back the Star of David that he stole years ago. Mr. Schreckerberg says, and because Ben Grimm thinks that it's Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, and then Schreckerberg's a little disappointed. He's like, you got the wrong day, but you can still keep it. And then the funniest part of this comic is, this is Powder Keg right here. And he says, because he's overhearing this conversation, are you really Jewish? To the Thing? And the Thing says, there a problem with that? And Powder Keg says, no, it's just, you don't look Jewish. And so this is just a great comic. So remembrance of things past. If you can read it, I suggest you read it. It's fun. And another, you don't want to deviate too much from your original writers and conceivers story, but in this case, we have a Thing that's a drawing by Jack Kirby, again, Jacob Kurtzberg, and this is showing him with a Siddur, a prayer book, and he had this in the family home. Now, there's the golden age of comics, and then we have the silver age of comics, and some call it the Marvel age. But I want to talk about something that most of you don't know about. You've heard of the Thing or Captain America or Batman and Robin, but you might not know about the Unknown Soldier. And Joe Kubert was a war comics artist. We have funnies comics and romance comics and war comics. There's so many different kinds of comics. Way more humor comics, which we'll get to too. But there's so much more than superheroes. It's just that everybody always wants me to talk about superheroes. So in this case, the Unknown Soldier, he had a lot of scars on his face from war. So he's always in a costume, like he's good. He always has his face covered in some way. And I'm showing you this briefly because he's in the Warsaw Ghetto. So this is a Jewish moment, right? He's saving this little girl, her name, this is a comic book that would just be on the shelves at any comic store. He's in the Warsaw Ghetto. He's saving this little girl with the red hair named Tova, which means God in Hebrew, means good in Hebrew. And it's pretty gruesome. And, only the dead leave the ghetto. So she's buried underneath a bunch of corpses as he's trying to save her. Joe Kubert was Jewish. He barely made it. He was a baby. He was a few months old when he left Poland. And so this is, and then he did many more Jewish things within this. But at the end of this comic, the Unknown Soldier says the Mourner's Kaddish because somebody has died. And the Unknown Soldier was not Jewish, or was he? Do we read too much into these comics if we know their makers are Jewish? And it's pretty phenomenal, I think, or remarkable even at this point that you've seen how many of these early makers are Jewish. Many people know the X-Men because of the movies, and the X-Men are a whole other sort of universe of, others, right? They're different in some way. And otherness is endemic to Jews, right? There's some believe that Jews are very much other. Magneto is a character from the X-Men. He's revealed as a Holocaust survivor. So you can see he's showing the numbers on his arm. So that's one connection to Jewishness. And it goes even a step further. They said he was a Sonderkommando, which is a really gruesome job in the camps. Now, I don't always like that because, you know, he's of questionable character, and they're attributing his questionable character, if we read it a certain way, as because he was a survivor. But a little bit more about X-Men. This is Kitty Pryde from X-Men. And obviously, you know, the comics are very different from the movies. We look at pages, we look at drawings, we think about color, we look at shapes. Speech bubbles are a whole different story. What do the speech bubbles look like? And are they thought bubbles? And are they narrative text? You know, comics are a whole different way of reading. And most importantly, they're a marriage of text and image. It's not just words that we read. It's not just pictures we look at. We look at everything together. And that's how it tells the story. So in this case, Kitty Pryde, this is again a comic book for the average person. This is Yahrzeit. And she is lighting a candle. She's lighting a Yahrzeit. I forgot to mention something. Stan Lee Lieber. He was really, you know, at the helm of Marvel. He created the superheroes who are more angsty, have more, it's not bright and so happy or so easy. These are superheroes who have surus, that have stress in their lives and talk about their issues and have major issues. So we're talking, he was involved directly or indirectly in the creation of Spider-Man or the Incredible Hulk or the X-Men. And Stan Lee actually just died very recently. If you watch a Marvel movie, then you can often, there's like a Where's Waldo moment in each movie where Stan Lee is somewhere. He's like, you can find him in the movies. So Kitty Pryde from the X-Men. This is, some people call these works like the superhero is outsider and Jews are outsiders. Again, you don't have to buy these metaphors at all. I'm just telling you some of these thoughts that we have. So the X-Men are a potent allegory for being born different, for sure. And so some say, oh, it's very clear where these Jewish writers got their inspiration. Well, a lot of teenagers feel different, right? You know, just showing you the other side of the coin. So Kitty Pryde is the first explicitly Jewish superhero. She comes around 1980. She often wore a Star of David necklace. In 2002, which is what we're looking at here, she mourns her boyfriend, Colossus, by lighting a Yahrzeit candle. In 1981, I'm going backwards, and you can look at this Yahrzeit candle and these images, but in 1981, there was an X-Men issue of Days of Future Past. So Days of Future Past. The mutants, the X-Men mutants, are hunted down and killed or imprisoned in concentration camps. So in the comic, there's a built-up sort of nationwide fear campaign fueled by politicians who want to eradicate all super beings. They force the mutants to wear the letter M on their clothing. And that echoes the Star of David that Jews wore in Nazi Germany. So just to think about some other issues, by the way, this is a semester class that I'm condensing for you. So again, let's move away from superheroes and talk about humor in comics. And humor, this is Mad Magazine. It was founded by Jews. It was actually founded by William Gaines, who was Max Gaines's son. So family industry. Mad Magazine is full of Yiddishisms and Jewish in-jokes that unless you're Jewish, you might not understand, different kinds of accents. It is some fun stuff. And Mad really influenced Harvey Pekar. Does anybody know who Harvey Pekar is? Oh, good. So he happens to be from Cleveland. Again, just a coincidence I live there. Just a coincidence Superman was made there. American Splendor, this was the first real confessional comics. And he published on his own for quite a long time. And then he ultimately got a publisher. But what I want to show you is that this is just like everyday minutia of life. And he makes it funny and he makes it poignant. So it's ironic title, by the way. American Splendor from off the streets of Cleveland comes. And so it's not splendiferous. He works for the VA. He lives in an average house. He's kind of schlubby. He definitely has a bad attitude. And that's what American Splendor works with. So, you know, it's like sort of working class life, which you see on the image on the left, but the image on the right is what I wanted to especially point out to you. He's having some eggs and they're not quite right. And he turns to his mom and says, did you put raw eggs in this? And she says, it's good for you, Herschel. So we see his Jewish identity coming through. That's his Yiddish name. So that kind of got me put on the path of, you know, lots of people talk about Jews and superheroes, but I'm like Harvey Pekar and Jewishness. And this is what Superman means to me. Well, Superman is the ultimate comic book character. Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster invented the idea of a superhero. And then there was all the copycats that came afterwards. In this case, what Superman means to me? Well, it's just a few pages, a 3-pager, and it's funny. I'll just tell you that there's a glossary on the top with Yiddish. Yiddish, Chazar means pig, hilaria, Rahmanis, have pity. And then he tells this story. And Art Crumb, who was a very important comics maker, made the thought bubble on top, and then a different artist made what's below. So essentially, Harvey is not getting the attention he deserves at a Comic-Con, and he is basically, Superman does not mean that much to him. He definitely didn't feel good about superheroes. Superman especially, I think he was a little jealous. And here's a different Harvey Pekar. Somebody asked me beforehand if I was going to talk about this in any way. So here we go. This is from Strange Tales 2. It's from 2010, and Harvey meets the Thing. And it's just funny. Basically, the punchline essentially is, the Thing is he's saying, is that you, Harvey? Harvey worked at the VA, as I told you. And the Thing's like, you retiring soon? I have bad knees. I need your job. Now, Harvey only did the writing. So that's important. There's writers. So you have the writers, you have the artists. So early on, Jerry Siegel was the writer and Joe Shuster was the artist for Superman. But in this case, Harvey can't draw at all. Like his sheets of information for his artists are like stick figures. But so he hired different artists at different times to draw his different comics. And so Harvey looks very different in different comic books. And because he's so funny, and this is very Jewish, this is just one panel out of a whole story again. And he says, today I am a man, because he unplugs the toilet. Well, which you're supposed to say when you have your bar mitzvah or your bar mitzvah, your bar mitzvah, today I am a man. And he wasn't much for organized religion. He did love Israel. And look at him, it's like he's holding up the Torah, but it's not the Torah. Today I am a man. And then he wrote a book, Harvey Pekar's Cleveland, in which he talks about Cleveland, and he loved Cleveland and lots of Cleveland landmarks. But this one's just funny. At the beginning, I'm sort of Cleveland Heights answer to the beloved literary character Tevye the Milkman from Fiddler on the Roof, as he's drinking milk straight out of his fridge from the carton. If you haven't seen American Splendor, the movie, I suggest it. You will love it. It's really fun. Will Eisner. So let's talk about some graphic novels and what a graphic novel actually is. A graphic novel, I'm paring it down to the essentials, is a more serious, longer form comic, essentially. And it doesn't always have to be more serious, but it often is. And this is A Contract with God by Will Eisner. Will Eisner really invented, or made the first graphic novel. That's sort of what we acknowledge generally in scholarship. And he wrote about graphic novels, and he wrote about what he called sequential art. So I think A Contract with God is related to Jewishness. Will Eisner was Jewish. His work is has a very sort of expressionistic feel. So A Contract with God and Other Tenement Stories, it takes place in the Bronx. And there's 3 stories that, have Jewishness involved with them. It's more sort of like New York stories in some ways, but A Contract with God. He makes a contract with God. The contract is, I'm going to be a good Jew. I'm going to do what you're asking me to do. I'm going to follow the rules. And then he has a daughter who dies. And that's breaking the contract. And I'm sure all of us have wondered why do bad things happen to good people? So here's just 2. No, not to me. You can't do this. We have a contract. It's just so dark and cinematic and noirish. I mean, this is different from everything we've talked about thus far, different from Mad Magazine or from Harvey Pekar or comics. And I think that feels really good that I'm showing this in this room right now. So if Eisner's the father of the graphic novel, Art Spiegelman is the perfecter of the graphic novel, in my opinion. So this, earlier Jewishness was kind of veiled, maybe. This is, have you read Maus before? Okay. If you haven't read Maus, I encourage you to. It is important for so many reasons. It's a great graphic novel, not because I study or write about Jewish graphic novels. It is a great graphic novel. It's a crucial graphic novel. It's one of the most important because of not just because it's about the Holocaust, because it's phenomenal. He worked on it for years. Every panel, you can find something new in after you read it the first time. There's plays on words, there's plays on images. The first volume came out in 1986. For those of you who might not be familiar with this, the Maus tells his father, Art Spiegelman's father, Vladek's story. So Vladek was in work camps, he was in Auschwitz, and he makes it out. I'm going to use first names for a little bit, it gets confusing. Art's mother also was in different camps, and she made it out so that they survived. And Vladek tells that story, but there's so many crushing things along the way that Vladek and Anya, Art Spiegelman's parents, had a son who died. His aunt poisoned him because she thought that they were all going to Auschwitz. So she poisoned herself and his cousins and the other son. His name was Richaud. So we learn about, over time, Vladek's story, but it's so much more than that. It's the story of Spiegelman's father and his survival. It's the story of a strenuous father-son relationship. And it's the story of the process of writing a comic book about the Holocaust. And it ends up not being a comic book, but these are just this was Spiegelman's thinking along the way. So Maus is as much about the Holocaust as it is about the enduring mark that it is felt on survivors and their families, and the process of trying to make sense of something that enormous that you didn't experience through art. So I have 2 little bits here, and on the left we see the mice. Oh, Jews are portrayed as mice in this. Germans are cats, Poles are pigs, and the French are frogs. And we have this bestiary of characters that are telling the story. This book was banned recently, by the way. Banned because there was a bad word somewhere and there were naked mice. Seriously, it's a vital book. It was banned, which made me teach it even more. So teach it in my Art in the Holocaust class or my American Jewish culture class. I decided I'm going to teach this in my 20th century art class. It's a work of art. We can look at Mondrian, Picasso, and Art Spiegelman. So I think when I talk about how there's so many different levels of meaning in this particular graphic novel, just this one panel here. So Anya and I didn't have where to go. In other words, Spiegelman retains his father's accent. And it says, we walked in the direction of Sonyoshwe, but nowhere to go. Well, nowhere to go because it's a swastika. The ground, the path is a swastika, and it all goes in different directions, but they all are a dead end. But you need to, there's that kind of level of, we need to look once, we need to look twice, we need to look more. Did I tell you that this won a special Pulitzer Prize? Because it did, and it deserved it. I want to also mention these two panels because I think one of the big problems was these naked mice, which are a metaphor for dead Jewish people. And these are the two most powerful pages, I think. On the left, time flies. All right, it's a play on words. Time does fly, right? He's conflating time. So that's Art Spiegelman wearing a mouse mask because he feels like a survivor, but he also feels like the imposter of a survivor. He's lived this. His mother also, she killed herself long after the war, and that's explored in this book as well. And she didn't leave a note. And Art Spiegelman writes about that. It's important to him to get that across in Mouse, but conflating time. Vladek died of congestive heart failure on August 18th, 1982. Francois and I stayed with him in the Catskills back in August 1979. That's his wife. So he's conflating time. Time flies. So Vladek started working on a tin man in Auschwitz in the spring of 1944. I started working on this page at the very end of February 1987. So we have two different works of art that are being made in very different places and for very different reasons. So in May 1967, Francois and I are expecting a baby. Between May 16, 1944 and May 24, 1944, over 100,000 Hungarian Jews were gassed in Auschwitz. And he's coming to grips with a lot of things. This is a very powerful, important page. In September 1986, after 8 years of work, the first part of Mouse was published. It was a critical and commercial success. And I'm telling you all this because this is the culmination. At least, we're in the bottom panel, he's at his drawing board, and look at all of these mice at the bottom. At least 15 foreign editions are coming out. I've gotten serious offers to turn my book into a TV special or movie. I don't wanna. In May 1968, my mother killed herself. She left no note. Lately, I've been feeling depressed. All right, Mr. Spiegelman, we're ready to shoot. The movie? Or look at the guard tower right here and look at all the dead Jews at his feet. So I've spent a few minutes on this because it's really a crucial part of this book. Because the book is about Vladek's story, it's about Art Spiegelman's story, it's about the Holocaust. And it's also about why would this ever be banned over those mice at the bottom. I'm very angry about it. I spent a lot of time talking about it to different groups. And in the end, and this is the end of Mouse as a whole, we have Vladek going to bed. He says, no more stories, Art, I'm tired. And he says, let's stop the tape recorder now. I'm tired from talking, Richaud. He calls Art by his dead son's name. And in the end, this is the end of the book. Here's a tombstone, Spiegelman. Vladek's dates, Anya's dates, and Art Spiegelman's dates are the dates he took to write Mouse. Do you want me to keep going or take questions? Do a little more? Okay, take a little bit more. Superman, to this day, he sometimes intersects with Jewishness. Here he is in the Warsaw Ghetto. He's half in Metropolis, he's half in the Warsaw Ghetto. This is 1998. and he's going in to save the Jews. This particular issue was published on the 60th anniversary of the original publication of Superman in 1938 with Action Comics #1 that we looked at. And so the writer wanted to tell a Jewish story in honor of the 2 Jewish boys who created Superman. We'll just skip. All right, we'll just go to this real quick. So you know that comic books, the comic medium also influences fine artists who make works that are in museums, for example. So Archie Rand, he's a favorite of mine. And he has looked at, he said, I asked him once, why do you make paintings that look like comics? And he said, I do that because I feel like comics are an intrinsically Jewish medium. My exemplars were all comics makers. He's very funny. He loved Mad Magazine because Mad Magazine was Jewish humor. And he loved Will Eisner. He knew Will Eisner. Actually, Archie showed me a great picture that he had with Eisner at one time. He just really admired him. He admired the spirit. In this case, this is Archie Rand's Adam. And Archie decided that he wanted to use Technicolor. And he also decided that he was really interested in speech bubbles. What can speech bubbles do? And what is the language of comics? I don't mean just the language of panels and gutters and splash pages and different kinds of color. He thought that language, how you have just a small speech bubble and you have to pare down the essentials to something, legible and understandable. So he said, so Adam and Eve, they're in the Garden of Eden and they realize that they're naked, but they have no clothes on. Well, there's like 15 verses about it. Archie said, well, what it comes down to is we're naked. And we see it in capital letters, like the same kinds of fonts that might be used in comic books or graphic novels, underlined several times, exclamation point. So this is sort of Archie's take. And he actually made a series called 60 Paintings from the Bible. And there's 60 of these. And some of them are funny. Some of them are poignant. All of them are clever. This one, I think, is clever. Oh, and he's not afraid to use swear words at all in these paintings. This exhibition, actually, there was an exhibition. It showed in Cleveland, it showed in Cincinnati, it showed in Pittsburgh. So I think the only place we sort of missed there was Columbus. This is Archie Rand's Isaac, and it's just a little deeper than the last one. When Abraham is preparing to sacrifice his son Isaac, he says in the Bible, Hanini, here I am. But in this case, I'm here I am, God, for you, I'm believing in you. But here it's, I'm here. I'm here, hello, I'm about to kill my son. Why don't you pay attention? So you can look up Archie Rand online. His images are very interesting. You can see a lot more of this. I think that it's a great project. And when you see them all together, this is what they look like. And these are just 2 rooms of many, many rooms in an exhibition. So to go back to the Man of Steel, Superman breaks through the walls of the ghetto. He saves the Jews. Of course, that didn't happen as much as we would want it to. It's a fantasy. But in this anniversary issue, I think what was interesting is in an homage, that's Lois Lane, she went with Superman. But we have these 2 boys, and they're Baruch and Moshe. It's a long comic book, and they were supposed to be a sort of nod to Siegel and Schuster's Jewish origins. And in Cleveland, if anybody wants to visit, we have a Superman sort of mania going on. This on the left, that's Superman's, that's Jerry Siegel's house he grew up in. Oh, I didn't mean to put the one where I'm so excited to be there, but I am always so excited to be there. And a family lives in there still to this day, essentially the Siegel and Schuster Society wants to turn it into a museum, but there's a family that's lived there for a very long time, and they're perfectly fine with us decorating their house. It's like this all the time. These 2 streets are Lois Lane and Siegel and Schuster Lane. Is that cute? Lois Lane. So that's what's on the signs above the actual names, and you can see Superman there. Cleveland celebrates Superman like crazy, as I said. This is the lot, that's the lot on top where Joe Shuster's apartment building was. And the panels from Action Comics #1 are all along the walls. The walls there. This is the when you come off baggage claim in Cleveland. That's what you see. Oh, and we have a Superman license plate. That's fine. And before we finish, and I'm very glad to take any questions. Do we have some questions online, or should I could talk about more comics if we don't, but Up and Oy Vey. These are my kids from like over a decade ago. And I said, they're mortified every time I show it. But so do we have questions or? Yes.
This is a weird question.
No question is weird. You're a professor. You know that.
Well, my question. The term Superman, the word Superman is from Nietzsche, the Übermensch. And I just wonder whether the two American boys, sons of immigrants, knew that word had been used in a really, really different way. And whether they did that on purpose or they didn't know about it, or what to know.
All right, so the question is, about the origins of the name Superman. Well, Action Comics came out in 1938, they've been working on it for many years before. So, that's when Superman first comes to the attention of the world and is published and so forth. So we don't know, but probably because, at one point, we're talking about a Superman Jewish now in the 21st century, but apparently, Hitler one day stood up angry in some sort of, meeting and denounced Superman as Jewish. And we have documentation about that. So we don't have an answer, but it's certainly a good question. And it's been discussed before, what did these boys know? I mean, did they know that El meant deity? Right. We don't know that. Like, is it a coincidence that Kal-El's, Superman's name was Kal-El? We can certainly with certainty say that, Captain America was created by Jewish comic makers, artist and writer, and was created with a super serum that was designed by Dr. Reinstein or Reinstein. Get it? Play on Einstein? Okay. Yes, in the back.
Thank you. This is really interesting. I'm wondering if you could kind of flip perspectives a little bit and maybe reflect from the endpoint of readers. And so the extent to which they identified the comic books they were reading with Jews or being Jewish in any way. And if that changes in significant ways, say from the origins in the 1930s, how they were perceived and maybe associated or not associated with creators would change their names, in the 30s, the 40s, versus more recently, given that you've showed us quite a spectrum of what we call Jewish themes, Holocaust, but not exclusively Holocaust, kind of a process chronological span too. So how are these viewed, or you at least reflect a little bit of the large question?
All right, so an overview of that question is that early on, there was no discussion of these are Jewish comic book makers or artists. It wasn't really known. This is just an industry that no one cared about so much at the beginning, which, exploded in popularity. And, we had more superheroes building on top of each other, building on top of each other. No one really knew that Stan Lee was a Jewish man or Will Eisner. And later on, Will Eisner, he did do Contract with God, and he even did his last graphic novel was The Plot. It was a sort of long discursive kind of graphic novel about the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, which was a anti-Semitic tract accusing Jews of things they didn't do, which happens a lot. And so this is a recent conversation. So I can, reflecting on it, there's nothing to reflect on except that these are scholars looking back and maybe rewriting history. maybe reading something into it. I think that some of this is read into it. I think that it isn't always like, I've presented to you ideas for you to reflect on, but these are some of the current conversations that are going on. So this is long after the fact. But comics makers, we saw some comic books that are thinking about these things in the 1980s or 1990s, the comics makers. But as far as like a scholarly discussion, or even a mainstream discussion, that is a much more current, like early 21st century, late 20th century phenomena.
And just, if I may, just a brief follow-up,
Mhm.
do you think that there is greater Jewish content? The ones you showed us where the thing is identified explicitly as Jewish, that was relatively recent.
Mhm.
Ghetto one also known. I mean, is there a greater willingness or openness towards explicitly Jewish themes in the last decade?
Absolutely. So if anybody didn't hear, is there a greater openness to explicit Jewish themes? 100%. But remember, like in the 1970s and 80s, we live in a multicultural America where it's okay to be different. In the 70s, the standard of beauty in this country was, Christy Brinkley or Cheryl Tiegs. In the 1990s, we have Jennifer Lopez and Selma Hayek. Like others can be beautiful, right? Ethnic is beautiful, ethnic difference, different kinds of cultures. It's just we live in a whole different America. And yes, Jewishness in comics is way closer to the fore, and especially in graphic novels. So there's a lot of graphic novels that are Jewish in content. And I should mention, in a few weeks, there is the first Jewish Comic-Con ever is being held in New York on November 11th and 12th. It's called Juicy. So Jew, then CE for Comics Experience. And on the Sunday day is all-day Comic-Con with many important comics luminaries. But the night before, there's a big award ceremony where you can get a Juicy, like an Emmy. So the Juicies are going to be handed out. So their tickets still available. So come to New York. There's going to be some really interesting figures and panels there. And there is going to be a whole panel on superheroes and comics. Yes, sir.
Well, you mentioned Siegel and Schuster, and it reminded me of a wonderful novel that I read called Cavalier Play. And I wondered whether that sets at all with the topic.
So you could repeat it for the people.
Yes, I figured. So Michael Chabon wrote The Adventures of Cavalier and Clay. And, the question was, how does that relate to Siegel and Schuster? So the novel is great. Didn't it win the Pulitzer? I think it did. Or the Nobel something. It won something. It's a tremendous book. And it is definitely has some roots in all this early comic history that I've shared with you. And, he knew Siegel and Schuster's ideas and their history. And it's based on all of these kind of comic book makers that we've discussed, but especially Siegel and Schuster. Hannah?
We have a question from the Zoom.
I'm ready.
Did the Jewish creators of these famous comics ever experience anti-Semitism? And if so, how did they deal with it?
So did the makers of the comics ever experience anti-Semitism, and how did they deal with it? I'm sure that they did at some point, because really most Jews in the 40s or 50s would at some point, but we don't really have much documentation about that. And one of the nice things about being a writer or an artist, and I'm a writer, so I can say, is that you can be alone a lot, which shields you from the outside world. But there's no like overt documentation about that. Jerry Siegel's dad was robbed. He had a haberdashery store, and he was robbed when Jerry Siegel was young. I don't say he was robbed because it was anti-Semitic, but that's a possibility. And he died of a heart attack in that robbery. Some people argue, again, because there's the thing about being a scholar or a thinker, is that you can throw out different ideas and reflections on different subjects that might have been part of the reason that Jerry wanted to write an invincible, Superman who cannot be pierced by bullets, who has heat vision and can conquer anything, that there is no villain to someone named Superman with those kinds of powers. Any other questions? Hannah?
I have a question that is not my question.
Oh,
And it's a little bit about reception.
Mhm.
So, you made a comment, that was sort of a question, do we read more into these comics if we know that their creators are Jewish?
mhm.
And I was wondering if you have, if you have further thoughts on that, and or if you have sort of seen through your research and the reception, how that kind of plays among Jewish audiences, non-Jewish audiences, or kind of what are the implications of reading into the comics in that way?
I think, so the question is about like, what are the implications of reading into comics? And we can make that even more broad, into anything from our personal perspectives. So do Jews read these comics different than non-Jews read these comics? Or do women read them different than men read them? And I think that that's all the case. And the implication is simply that we come at things from our own perspectives. I mean, we can't not. And so the in-jokes, for example, in Mad Magazine, the Jewish in-jokes, and there are tons of them. We know who's going to get those and who's not going to get those. And I think it's the nature of the medium, but I think it's almost even the nature of any artistic medium. Even the mystery novel that you might read tonight before bed, you're going to read it differently than I will. If there are any more questions, I can show more comics. We can just hang out for a little bit and talk about ideas. You let me know. What would you like?
If there is interest for one more question, either from the room or from the Zoom, we can pursue that.
I was going to pull up some more images if you want, but I don't have good control. You tell me.
I think if there's like one or two more images that you wanted to share that you didn't get to share, let's do that. And then we can find a place to end.
Well, I don't have an overview of my slides on this computer, so I don't know where to go. But you have a question, so let's go for it.
Yeah, what started your interest in this particular field?
Okay, the question was, why am I interested in this particular field? My mother's been asking me that question for a lot of years. Why, Samantha, why? I just was always attracted to the colors of comics and sort of the fantasy of them. Well, fine, that interested me. But then I went, so I have my degree is in art history. And one day I woke up and thought, someone could talk about these comics as works of art. And they are now, but I wanted to talk about them from the perspective of like the imagery or the iconography and color and style. A lot of people just talk about the writing, the writing or the images. So a long time ago, I just started incorporating it into my classroom. And then I realized I could make this like a thing and a career out of it. So it's like combining my childhood passion with my art history career. Like I also spend a lot of time talking about Mona Lisa. And I just feel like comics and I feel really excited to be here in this particular space, not just the Eisner Room, but the whole, Billy Ireland environment to talk about this. And I hope you take comics more seriously in the future and less seriously in the future and read them a little bit more.
Thank you so much for this talk, and that thing that you were saying at the end about kind of making connections between some of the other art historical investigations that you do related to comics ties really nicely into some of the stuff you were talking about in Robin Judd's class this morning, between making connections between some canonical artistic imagery and sculpture with some of the things that appear in some of the material culture surrounding our production related to the Warsaw Ghetto that relates to your recent book. So that's a nice way of tying everything together, and it's a really exciting way to think about the different ways that your scholarship and your interests kind of go across multiple media. So thank you so much for coming
Thank you very
today
much,
and being
Anna.
with
It's
us
great.
for this day, and thank you all for coming to this talk today. Have a good afternoon.